Brian Jones was more than just a musician. He was a visionary. Long before the world worshipped Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, he was the heart and soul of the Rolling Stones. He was the one who handpicked the band members, shaped their sound, and gave them their identity. But in the summer of 1969, Brian was thrown out of the very band he had created. And just 1 month later, he was dead. Drowned in his own swimming pool. Was it an accident? Murder? Or was it just another piece of the dark curse that seemed to haunt him from the start? Years later, when Mick Jagger was asked if he regretted how Brian was treated, his response was, disturbing. It wasn't sorrow. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even respect. It was cold. Dismissive. And almost proud of what had happened. So today, we're diving into the story the Rolling Stones don't like to talk about. The story of Brian Jones, the man who created a legend, only to be destroyed by it. The birth of the Rolling Stones. In the early 1960s, rock music belonged to the Beatles. They were clean-cut, charming, and adored by the public. But Brian Jones? Brian wanted something else. He had a vision, something raw, something rebellious. He wanted a band that played pure, electrifying blues. Something that felt dangerous. So, in 1962, he formed the Rolling Stones. He placed an ad looking for musicians and found two guys named Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And from the very beginning, there was a power struggle. Mick and Keith had the charisma, but Brian had the talent. He could play anything, slide guitar, sitar, harmonica, even exotic instruments no one had ever used in rock music before. But talent didn't matter. Not in the world of rock and roll. Because while Brian was the musical genius, Mick and Keith had the ambition. And that would make all the difference. The slow destruction of Brian Jones. By the mid-60s, the Rolling Stones were one of the biggest bands on the planet. But Brian? Brian was fading away. Drugs, alcohol, and personal struggles had begun to take their toll. He was arrested multiple times for drug possession. His once innovative guitar playing was becoming unreliable. And worst of all, he was losing control. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had taken over songwriting. They were the ones getting the spotlight. They were the ones shaping the future of the band. Brian, the man who had created the Rolling Stones, was slowly becoming a nobody in his own band. And the final betrayal? Mick and Keith stole the woman he loved. The Anita Pallenberg betrayal. Brian had been deeply in love with model and actress Anita Pallenberg. But their relationship was volatile. It was passionate, but also violent and destructive. And then, during a trip to Morocco, Brian fell sick. He was too weak to travel, too weak to fight. And that's when Keith Richards made his move. Keith and Anita left Brian behind. Just like that. Brian never recovered. Not just from the heartbreak, but from the realization that his bandmates, his friends, had no loyalty to him. And it only got worse from there. The final betrayal, kicked out of the Rolling Stones. By 1969, Brian was in bad shape. He barely showed up to rehearsals. He couldn't keep up with the band. And that's when Mick Jagger and Keith Richards made the decision. Brian had to go. On June 8, 1969, they called him to a meeting and told him he was out. The official reason? Musical differences. The truth? Brian Jones, the founder of the Rolling Stones, had become a liability. He was kicked out of his own band. 1 month later, he was dead. The mysterious death of Brian Jones. On the night of July 2, 1969, Brian was found face down in his swimming pool at his home in England. He was just 27 years old. The official cause? Death by misadventure. A mixture of drugs, alcohol, and a tragic accident. But not everyone believed that. There were rumors that Brian had been murdered. That a builder working at his house, a man named Frank Thorogood, had drowned him during an argument. There were whispers that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards knew more than they were saying. And even today, the truth is still unclear. But what's even more shocking than Brian's death? The reaction of his former bandmates. Mick Jagger's chilling response. Years later, when Mick Jagger was asked if he regretted how Brian was treated, his answer wasn't what you'd expect. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. Instead, he laughed. In a 1995 interview, Mick dismissed Brian as being kind of difficult and said, "People talk about him like he was a martyr, but he wasn't. He was very troubled, and he let things get away from him. It was cold. It was detached. And it was proof that, for Mick, Brian was already forgotten." Even Keith Richards, who had stolen Brian's girlfriend and helped push him out of the band, once admitted, "I don't think we handled it too well." Too well. Brian Jones was dead. And the Rolling Stones moved on like he had never existed. The legacy of Brian Jones. Today, Brian Jones is often overlooked when people talk about the Rolling Stones. But the truth is, without him, there would be no Rolling Stones. He was the band's original driving force. The real innovator. And maybe that's why his story is so tragic. Because in the end, his own creation turned against him, and the people he trusted the most. They left him to die. Mere days after Brian's passing, the Stones performed a tribute concert in Hyde Park. Mick Jagger read poetry, White Butterflies were released, but some felt it was all just a show. Brian had been discarded in life, and now, in death, he was a ghost. But decades later, when Mick Jagger was asked if he regretted the way Brian had been treated, his answer shocked fans. Jagger smirked and simply said, "Regret? No, not really. It was inevitable." That cold response sent shivers down the spines of longtime fans. Brian Jones was the man who had created the Rolling Stones, and yet, in the end, he was treated as disposable. Footage of Brian Jones playing guitar, smiling, then fading into a haunting image of his grave. Brian Jones lived fast, burned bright, and died young. He left behind a musical legacy that shaped rock and roll forever. But he also left behind a haunting question: was his fate truly an accident, or was he a victim of something much darker? One thing is certain, the Rolling Stones' cursed genius will never be forgotten. Brian Jones was a genius. A tortured, complicated, and deeply flawed genius. But one thing is certain, he didn't deserve the way he was treated. And the way the Rolling Stones moved on without him. The way Mick Jagger dismissed his death with a laugh. It's proof that in the world of rock and roll, loyalty means nothing. But what do you think? Was Brian Jones' death just a tragic accident? Or was there something more to the story? Let me know in the comments below. And if you love uncovering the real stories behind rock and roll's biggest legends, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because trust me, there are so many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, keep the music loud and the questions louder.